Hey everyone, I'm Alanna Burke, and this is Writing Inclusive Documentation. I am the documentation writer, trainer, and development advocate at Amazy.io. You can find me on D.O and Twitter at aburke626. So we're going to cover a handful of topics today. First, we're going to talk about why inclusive documentation is important and why your documentation needs to be inclusive. And we're going to go over a handful of things that go into this. Don't make assumptions, don't exclude people, some don'ts. We'll talk about accessibility, we'll talk about writing and content, and then we'll touch on some design. So let's talk about why. Your documentation should make people feel supported. You know, people don't want to feel excluded. They don't want to be labeled as inferior, either as individuals or as members of a group. The things that you write and the things that you communicate can exclude or imply inferiority without meaning to. And people come to your documentation to learn and to find out how to use the things that you're teaching them to use. So we want to make sure that we're not making them feel worse when we want to be making them feel better and feel empowered and understand how to do the things that we want them to know how to do. So let's talk about assumptions. Documentation exists to teach. People come to your documentation to learn. You want to engage them, not turn them away. People come to you from all kinds of backgrounds at all stages of their career. You know, just because you're documenting some kind of advanced DevOps concept, you can't necessarily assume that the person is an advanced DevOps engineer. Maybe they're a web developer who just needs this one thing to make their website work right. I know that in my career, I've been that person, and I've gone down a huge wormhole of things that were way more complex than I actually understood. Maybe they're a web designer whose boss said, hey, you do web things, make this work for our site. And they're completely out of their wheelhouse. In general, in life, we make assumptions, but especially anything that has to do with users or communication, don't make assumptions about the people that you're trying to communicate with. And some things that will help us in not making assumptions is to define everything. Don't assume that a user knows what tools and programs you're talking about. Define them or link to them. Every single thing that I documentation, I either link to, if it's a tool or something, I link to it, or I link to a definition, or maybe I have a glossary or an appendix at the end to make sure that everything that gets talked about, there's a definition. People are going to know what that is. So that kind of goes into our next step, which is be comprehensive. If you mention it, cover it. If you're talking about some or something that they need to use, talk about what it is. If it's something that isn't really in your wheelhouse, like you're saying, okay, you need to generate SSH keys, blah, 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 then link to how to generate SSH keys. Make sure that people know how to do every single step that you're talking about. And make sure that you're meeting users at their level. Don't assume that your users are advanced. Your documentation should allow them to start. So cover absolutely everything. And don't exclude people. Be aware of your word choices. This is a tough one, and it's something that we have to do in all of our communication, in all of our everyday life. So let's go over some common language pitfalls. Ableism. This is something that we want to make sure that we're avoiding everywhere in life, but it is something that I see in tech a lot. So your code isn't driving you crazy. You're not OCD about tabs versus spaces. You don't need a sanity check and your app isn't cripplingly slow. You're not triggered by writing in a language that you don't like. And also avoid using terms like dummy variable. When talking about gender in tech writing, we can generally avoid this. You can see the user, so instead of saying things like the user uses his password to log into his account, you can say things like log into your account with your password. Or you can use the singular they, and the user logs into their account with their password. You never want to use he/she, that's just not generally accepted anymore. And also avoid using terms like man hours or mankind. And of course, there's plenty of other terms we want to avoid. One that I hear more often is things like that old spaghetti code is really ghetto. I actually heard someone say something like that fairly recently, and I was surprised that people still say things like that. So be aware. There are great substitutions for all of these kinds of words. You just have to get used to using them. And avoid jargon and idioms. This is something that came recently. You want to make sure that you're considering a global audience. And there's a lot of reasons for this. They may have offensive or racist origins. We use jargon to create a more comfortable setting, but it can have the opposite effect. And folks from other cultures and language may not understand them. This can lead to them misunderstanding your content or feeling excluded. Many idioms just don't translate well from country to country. So saying something like a sports metaphor, like hit it out of the park, can change your attempt at encouragement into embarrassment if the person doesn't know anything about baseball. So try to say something more like, I believe in you, or I know you can do this. And of course, many of your users aren't going to be from the US. So you'll be writing for a lot of people whose first language isn't English. Make sure that you're always keeping that in mind. This is one of the biggest things I see in technical writing. Don't condescend to your users. It isn't easy for everyone. Don't describe things as easy, simple, obvious. Your users come from all kinds of backgrounds. You want them to feel like they're welcomed when learning to use your product or code. Don't discourage them by making them think something should be easy when it might not be. If someone doesn't find your instructions easy, obvious, this comes across as condescending. You're also accidentally excluding people from your documentation if they interpret this as an indication that they're not smart enough or not skilled enough to engage with your technology. Make sure that you acknowledge what's hard. If it's a complex concept, then that's okay, but make sure that you say so. Let your users know when they're that's a little tougher so that they feel prepared and they feel like they're not alone if they don't get it right away. And avoid telling them to just do this or that. Live demos have taught us all that if nothing else, technology is unpredictable. They could follow your instructions perfectly and have a step fail through no fault of their own. Live demos have certainly taught me this in the past. Don't make them feel more frustrated. They should be able to just do it. Here's some things that you should make sure to do. Keep your docs updated. This needs to become a part of your developer culture. When code is updated, so is documentation. They also need to be edited. Consider making this the duty of one person who has considerable writing experience and is a keen editor, but someone who also has technical experience. Having a dedicated person to keep up your documentation can save you a lot of trouble. And you can ask my boss if you don't believe me. Make your docs searchable. People are going to search if they need to just find one thing. Help them. Give example code with use cases. Why would I do this? Why would I need this? Why would I use this in this? One of the first things I noticed in the documentation at Amazy.io when I came on board was that we had a lot of examples, which was great. but I had no idea what they did. So I went back to our developers and I asked them to give me use cases for each of our examples. And here's some don'ts. Don't make people download something. They don't want to download your PDF. They don't want it, and you can't keep PDFs up to date. Don't hide your documentation links. Don't keep them deep within your website. Put them front and center. Don't rely on only video documentation. It's not as accessible for many people, and a lot of people don't learn well that way. Don't skip steps. Guide users through each step. Times, documentation just gives the big steps, assuming users can fill in the blanks. Don't assume anything. Give them all the information they need. I always love this owl meme I see everywhere. Draw some circles. Draw the rest of the owl. Don't do this in your documentation. Nobody likes this, and it's not helpful. Accessibility. Don't ignore the principles that you apply to. They apply to your documentation as well. Make sure whatever platform that you choose is accessible. And in the larger sense of accessibility, make sure that your documentation is accessible in that it's easy to get to. Make sure that there is one canonical source for your documentation. Keep that up to date. If you have legacy documentation, make sure that it's clearly marked and that it links to your current documentation. Images. Use them when needed and ensure that they're large enough or link to a larger version. They should have a description. Diagrams should be explained in text. If you use videos or GIFs, they must be captioned or have a transcript. And going back to thinking about a global audience, can your documentation be translated? Is it available in other languages? Really consider this if your product is specifically often targeted at folks in another country. Writing is obviously a major part of documentation. So we need to talk about some of the things to make sure that you are making your writing itself inclusive. Readability is a major one. You want to make sure that your writing is at a grade 9 level or below. Use a tool like the Hemingway app to grade your writing. It doesn't have to be perfect. Because of the nature of technical writing, there's going to be big words or sentences that you just can't make shorter. That's okay, but do the best you can. Most people can only comfortably read writing that's 4 to 5 years below their maximum education level. So if you're thinking that a grade 9 sounds pretty low, if you add 5 years to that, you're still what's comfortable for a college grad, pretty much. You want to aim for a sentence length of less than 20 words. Try to keep to 2-syllable words rather than 3 or 4-syllable words when you can, and use contractions. Be aware of your sentence structure. Keep them short. Divide them up where you can. And avoid big words and technical jargon wherever you can pull it out. Technical writing is going to have some technical jargon. That's the nature of it, but don't overuse it. Technical writing is also very dry. Try to keep it conversational where you can, again, without using idioms or jargon. I try to write my documentation as though it were being read aloud, so my sentences are short and they're a little heavy on the commas. One common pitfall that I us in writing documentation is pronoun confusion and ambiguity. So referring to multiple things in the same paragraph or sentence by the same pronoun over and over, so to the point where you don't know what they're talking about. So when in doubt, just keep using the noun. And design. Make sure it's readable. Use white space, break up your paragraph. Absolutely no one will read a wall of text. When I was doing some research for this talk, I think I found 5 or 6 different places where it was just a complete wall of text. I'm certainly capable of reading a wall of text. I absolutely do not want to. I can probably find that information elsewhere on the internet. And that's what people are going to think. If they open up a link and it's a wall of text, they're going to close the tab. No one wants to read that. Markup. This goes a little bit back to accessibility as well. Use it properly. It's not for design, but it should make your text flow nicely. And be consistent in your design. Keep your text, your headers, and your fonts, etc., consistent. It's not as much about making your documentation pretty as it is making it pleasing and easy to read. And I've added a few resources to the end of this presentation. The Hemingway app is one that I use extensively in my writing. I copy and paste almost everything that I write into this. There's also Grammarly, which has a bunch of different ways to use the app. And a really great style guide that I have found is the Conscious Style Guide, which gives you a lot of tips on using different kinds of words to replace some of the words that we talked about, of talking about ableism and race and other things like that. It's a great bookmark to have just around if you're writing something and you think, gosh, I don't know what another way to word this is, which is something that I come across all the time, and I have discussions with friends. I also wanted to mention, and I didn't mention this in the ableism slide, was, just because you found yourself using some of those terms doesn't make you a bad person. You aren't trying to hurt anybody's feelings. A lot of these are terms that we've all grown up using, and we are just trying to make things a little better. And sometimes it can be really hard to find the correct, or what you feel is a correct way to rephrase them. So having style guides like this is really helpful to find a way around some of those. A recent one that a friend asked a group of other folks in a Slack channel about was how to better phrase going in blind. A phrase that you might say all the time, and we thought, wow, that's a really tough one, and we came up with a bunch of different solutions, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but that was a term I might not have flagged immediately for being, using some ableist language. And so having things like the Conscious Style Guide is really helpful for navigating stuff like that. So that's all I've got, and we're just exactly at half an hour. So if anyone has any questions, I think we can open to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I think it's been really helpful. I think we're fortunate enough to have a kind of inclusive environment in terms of some of the language pitfalls that you surfaced here. We definitely struggle from this wall of text, problem that you surfaced as well. And I think most critically, we really struggle with, I think defining a really clear hierarchy between certain categories that might be included in documentation. The difference between like a how-to and a tutorial, reference material, how to fold that in properly, and generally speaking, leading users through documentation in a meaningful way. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that or experience through your work.
I think that can be tough. I have definitely dealt with some of that. I think, our documentation has a lot of like, here's our sort of generic documentation that explains this, but then we also have step-by-step guides. I found that some of those sort of more tutorial step-by-step guides kind of in a logical way, like, hey, this is, this fits under, a kind of a parent topic, and I've done it that way and said like, okay, so here's the things you need to learn, and then once you've read through some of this, then you're ready to go through this step-by-step guide. So I think that can work sometimes. Sometimes if you just have a bunch of different how-tos or FAQs, sometimes you can just make a how-to section or a tutorial section or an FAQ section. That can be more useful than trying to jam it in somewhere where it might not fit. You know, like I think sometimes there can be a sort of like, here's our quote unquote like regular documentation where it feels a little, I don't know, maybe more like textbooky, like, you know, we're teaching you things here, and then here, you know, here's our tutorial section where we kind of have walkthroughs and we show you different things. I don't know, does that make sense? Is that kind of
Yeah, and
thing?
I think it's kind of in line with what we're toying with right now. I think like, you know, this wall of text problem is largely produced out of this lack of organization, wherein it's like you end up with a wall of text because you're not sort of categorically looking at the information that you're providing. And I think yeah, what you're saying makes sense in terms of like trying to kind of separate the concerns out in a meaningful way. Um,
Afraid to have more pages. Like if I feel like a page is really long or there's just too much on one page, I don't want to have like 800 pages, but on the other hand, I I'm not afraid to break things into a few pages if I feel like they're just getting
mhm,
cumbersome and
mhm.
starting to look just too long. I think that's okay, especially if you're like nesting them and you have lots of parents. I do sometimes see something that I think is almost as a wall of text is when you go to a documentation page and they have like 100 parent pages. And I'm like,
Mhm.
whoa, what is going on here? That's a lot. Maybe you
Right,
need
right.
divide that up a little more.
Yeah. I really appreciated your baseball reference, by the way, because I literally like 5 minutes ago was talking to my CEO who had written a piece of documentation that referenced baseball, and I was like, I don't watch baseball. You're gonna have to tell me what this means. um, felt very close to home there.
All right. Thanks for that, Ben. Alanna, we have a question from Ralph. It's in the question section of the control panel.
Oh,
If you expand that, and he's got a few follow-up comments as well.
oh, okay.
Do you see it?
Oh, so what degree of jargon is acceptable? An example would be the Drupal documentation is due to the high number of Drupalisms. Okay, so I think that doesn't fall under jargon so much as like technical. Um, I guess that's like technical jargon, and I think that would fall under just trying to define everything and not making assumptions about your users. So I agree, there are lots of places in the Drupal documentation where we make assumptions about where our users are in their Drupal journey. And that is something that you shouldn't do. You know, if you're saying, you know, if you're assuming that a user knows how to do something in Drupal, or, you know, some Drupal inside baseball, which, oh my God, there is so much of, um, you know, don't do that. Link it back to something else in the Drupal documentation. Define what you're talking about. You know, don't assume that people know what, I don't know, Drupal Geddon was, or, you know, how to do X, Y, and Z in Drupal. Um, I have a lot of things I would love to work on in the Drupal, and I know that I do not have enough time to devote to it right now. And there are lots of great people working on it. But that is something I have also seen in there. And that's the kind of thing that I think it makes a community really not inclusive. You know, I think if you're looking at a piece of documentation and you're seeing all of these terms that you don't understand and they're not linked and they're not defined. So I think that's a really good question. See, there were some other questions in here.
There were comments and suggestions.
Okay.
Ralph gave a link as a recommendation.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of stuff about readability guidelines, all of which are good. There are so many of them. These are a couple that I like that are really popular and used a lot. And those are the just kind of the main are sentence and syllable length. But yeah, don't be afraid to dive into some more readability guidelines.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions in the audience? You can unmute yourselves if you do, or some comments. I do have a question for you, Alanna, because being in my current role at my employer, I am now doing a lot of technical writing. One of the issues I've had, obviously, depending on who's reviewing it and approving the documentation, it can be very subjective. And their concern is that it gets overly cumbersome and it's hard to know who's the responsible party for different steps when you're writing instructions or a standard operating procedure together. So they're suggesting we put a RACI together and put that into the document as well. But then they're also kind of troubled by the fact that there's so much vocabulary that's technical that we have to define up front. They use a lot of acronyms, custom acronyms. So I feel it's important to have those things up front, but they feel it clogs the document and it makes it really hard because you can't just jump right into something without going through all that information. So he's suggesting that I move it into an appendix at the end. What are your thoughts about how to reference that kind of material, setting up expectations as to who's who as you work through and talk to certain people in your writing?
So I think you sort of have two questions there. So are you asking about like setting up who is like responsible for writing each piece?
No.
Or
so for example, we're writing a standard operating protocol, and there's steps and instructions in there that apply to, let's say, a social media coordinator for setting up a Facebook page. But then there's things for the marketing people that are about, setting up their advertising campaigns and things like that tied to the Facebook page. So they want one document, but it covers all these different parties as they relate to, in this example, Facebook and how they use Facebook for promotions and things. And they're concerned that right now we need a clear-cut RACI in the document, and then on top of that, there's a lot of terminology that's Facebook specific that he feels people wouldn't understand or know what it means. So I propose putting up front early in the document that RACI that indicates, these are the different parties that may be involved in this process, and certain things will be targeted to certain individuals or parties. And then in addition to that, definitions of common terminology or acronyms that are used throughout the document. And he's saying instead of putting that at the beginning, put it at the end of the document as an appendix.
Well, I think it sounds like to me that you should sort of do maybe half and half, like have, if you need to define like the people that are being referenced, I think it sounds like that's really important, and that should go up front and say like, this is for these people and this is for these people and these are the people being mentioned. And of acronyms and terms being defined, like with acronyms, I always want to define the acronym in line the first time, but if that also needs, or if you have more terms and stuff that need definition, I do think linking them out to an appendix is fine, but I would definitely stress linking them and not just having an appendix, because people tend to not go looking for appendices. Right. If there's just a citation there, but there are definitely times when I've used glossary we had some client documentation that got extremely long and they wanted everything defined, so everything linked to an appendix glossary, and I think that worked really, really nicely. So I think, it sounds to me like you have some really important stuff that has to go in the beginning and some other stuff that could go at the end.
Right. Great. And then one other thing related to that, in the case that you're doing screenshots to go with whatever documentation you're doing, for example, instructions, do you have any suggestions about annotating of those annotations within those screenshots versus just having copy to the side of it describing what to look for and what to do?
I think it's fine if you have some, like an arrow or two. If they're getting ridiculously marked up, I think maybe you need a shot, or maybe you needed a video or something else. Right. And also, if you have more than one arrow, you probably aren't going to be able to describe them in a way that's going to be accessible.
Right.
I mean, screenshots in and of themselves are hard to make completely accessible, but that's also sometimes a little bit, I think, unavoidable. just sort of because of the nature of them. But you can do the best you can, like this is an arrow point, top right menu that says XYZ or something like that. But if you've got more than one thing that you're trying to describe within your screenshot, then you're probably overdoing it. And I also think that a lot of people tend to do too many screenshots when, like, you don't want to assume anything about your users, but also don't assume that your users aren't smart.
Right.
Most of your users have, if they're on your documentation, they are at least using a computer. If you they can probably find the thing. They don't need a screenshot for every single step in the process, generally. But of course, adapt that to what you know about your users.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Back to the attendees. Any further questions?
Yeah, I kind of bringing it back to jargon or what was mentioned in a previous questions, Drupalisms. I work at another open source CMS, apostrophe CMS, and we have our own share of apostrophe-isms. I'm kind of wondering if you have a philosophy around creating unique names for common concepts versus using a term that might be more widely understood or kind of in vogue. I think it's something that we kind of struggle with when considering new features and concepts and how to write about them and how to properly weave in that those isms into a documentation in a way that's friendly and doesn't expect a lot.
I think every project struggles with this, and I think it kind of depends on how granular you're getting. Like, for example, Drupal has modules, which is, how we install new functionality, and other call them extensions. And I think, things like that are confusing for a couple of seconds, but there isn't really one term that's going to be more or less confusing. Because I don't think there's one accepted term that everyone in the world is going to magically know if you call it that.
Right.
And you just remember, like, oh, well, it's called a module in Drupal, and it's called an extension and whatever, and it's called press, and you just have to remember that. And I don't think that there's a particular way around that. But if you find yourself trying to, like, name something, different just for the sake of naming it something different in your own project, I think that's probably where you should step back and be like, well, why don't we name it the same as such and such project names it, because that's what everyone else, that's what I understand, or something like that. And I think that that's a really tough one. And I'm also, like, I'm trying to think of this, and I'm so I've been using Drupal for so long that I was trying to think of an example of, like, what else would we call a node? And I'm like, I don't know what else I would call a node.
Yeah.
Because that's what I've called that thing for so long. But I should just be thoughtful of and be like, would people understand what this is rather quickly, or would they get really confused because it's completely different from what every other CMS calls it,
Right. Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's like I'm working at a company that has existed for many, many years and has its own bit of jargon. And there's kind of a camp of new people and people that have been there for a really long time. And I think we find this tension a lot in terms of the breadth of understanding of some of the isms. So I think bringing it back to, like, what is a node, right? Same thing. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Just to add to the comments that Ben was pointing out and what you were saying, Alanna, the agency I used to work at, we did Drupal and WordPress. And the developers would come on board, and generally they'd have experience in one but not the other. So what we did for part of our onboarding was we'd go through the jargon for both, and we had a table that basically compared and described what's what, so that they'd understand it. And that was really helpful for them when we could do that. Another example is with Drupal, there's a module called paragraphs, and it's the most confusing name ever, because when you start talking about paragraphs, you're thinking like specific blocks of text and content, but it's actually used to make any type of designed component you might have on the site, a fieldable entity that you'd want to repeat and use different places. So we use it for calls to action, we use it for slides on a carousel. So what I've done with the designers that we work with, rather than refer to it as the paragraphs module or we need a paragraph for that, I say we need a component for that. And that makes it a little easier from a generic, high level, without having to know all the isms specific to a platform.
Yeah, this makes me think about how to explain Drupal terms to clients, which could be an entirely different talk.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I think the table is a really interesting idea.
Any other questions? All right. Alanna, do you have any closing remarks?
No, but thank you for the great Q&A.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Going to end the webinar. Hope you're getting the most out of the day.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.